Hello, ladies and gents. It's Justin Johnson on the module A225 Block 3 Decline and Renewal 1880 to 1914, edited by Mackie, Unit 20 Britain, Empire and Imperialism. This influence the youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, mature adults. You know, better your surroundings, better your diversity. You need to make sacrifices. You need a methodical approach as you move forward. You need to look after your demeanour, your mental health, and your well-being. Page 232. The level of giving and taking others. This affected their cultures. Plural greatly with people's views and values on virtually every matter. Not only the empire, being far more influenced by their class situation than by any more general national discourse. Porter 2004. Porter suggests that the uppers and upper middles were the most committed to empire for reasons of their social origins and education. Porter 2004. I have outlined Porter's argument very briefly here, and of course, he goes into much detail in his book to provide evidence for his case. His minimum of apathy is one of those phrases that is persuasive simply because it is so well expressed. But we might question whether the fact that the British Empire did not require the British population to have an imperialist culture means that they did not have one. Unit 15 explored a number of paintings and books that illustrate how imperial themes become part of British culture. Another cultural product, in this case a song called MacDermot's War Song, has given us the term jingoism, goism, which is often used to regard attitudes that seem excessively nationalistic and perhaps aggressively so. Written by G. W. Hunt, 1839 to 1904, and first performed by G. H. MacDermot, 1845 to 1901. In 1887, the song became popular in the music halls that you recall from Unit 19 becomes such an important part of working class culture in the late 19th century. It was written down during the international crisis when Russia threatened Istanbul. Still then known to the British, Constantinople, despite centuries of Turkish possession, the dogs of war are loose, and the rugged Russian bear, full, bent on blood and robbery, has crawled out of his lair, it seems, a thrashing now and then will never help to tame that brute. And so he's bent upon the same old game. The lion did his best to find him some excuse to crawl back to his den again. All efforts were no use, he hungered for his victim. He's pleased when blood is shed, but let us hope his crimes may all recoil on his own head. We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. We fought the bear before. And while we're Britons, true, the Russians shall not have Constantinople. If the song may not seem to be directly about empire, imperial interests were perceived affected by the Russian threat because if the Russians took Constantinople, it was feared they could control the eastern Mediterranean and put at risk Britain's passage to India through the Suez Canal, opened in 1869. Jingoism became a common term to describe those who wished to fight wars to protect British interests in far-flung places. Although aggressive in tone, the song can also be seen as a consequence of fears of relative decline. As states such as Russia grew in power and seemed to challenge British might, as you'll see in section 20.3. Jingoism was not confined to the music halls but become a factor in British politics. Mackenzie's propaganda in Empire looks at the various ways in which the empire was sold to the public. A supposed need to promote the empire is not proof, of course, that the public were generally indifferent to empire, but the apparent belief is worth noting, especially in the context of the anxieties about British decline. In his chapter on Empire and Metropolitan Cultures in the Oxford History of the British Empire, Mackenzie, 1999, while arguing for the importance of empire in 19th century British culture, acknowledges that there was not a single British culture but several British cultures, divided not only by class but also by nation, with the English, Welsh, Scots, and Irish each having their own histories, and scholarship has shown that empire was pervasive in education, entertainment, and social activity in Britain, and that cultural practices were in, inseparable from the political and economic dimensions of imperialism. Mackenzie, 1999. Page 235, Unit 20.1, Imperialism and Imperial Culture. Read the following extract from Mackenzie chapter mentioned above. Know that Hobson is J. A. Hobson, 1858-1940, a noted critic of imperialism in the first half of the 20th century, who is still referred to by historians today. How does Mackenzie portray the cultural relationship of the working classes with the British Empire? The truly distinctive theoretical form of the later 19th century was, however, the music hall. This developed from traditional entertainment in pubs and song and supper saloons, mainly in working class areas. By the 1870s, licensing policies were creating a divide between drinking and the provision of variety shows, and there was a countrywide explosion in theatre building. Music halls sprang up in almost every town, and similar entertainments were provided on all of them. Patriotic song scenes featuring uniformed performers, the showing of the flag, and even representations of Britannia and Queen Victoria invariably formed a significant part of such shows. The tableau vivant was another characteristic form, sufficiently respectable to appear in church halls as well as theatres. These tableaux often featured well-known patriotic and imperial events, recreating frozen dumb show. Sometimes they followed a well-known painting, thus providing an additional spark of visual recognition for the audience, or took up a key moment in the Indian Mutiny or General Gordon's death. This kind of matter led Hobson to portray the music hall as a fount of patriotism, a potent educator, a mob of mob passion, appealing by coarse humour of exaggerated pathos to the animal's lust of an audience stimulated by alcohol in appreciative hilarity. Many historians have found this seriously overdrawn, however. More recent research indicates that such entertainment was indeed enormously popular in both the working class halls of London's East End and middle class theatres of West End and wealthier suburbs. Even as Hobson's language is excessively lowered, patriotic shows prominently featuring imperial material were undoubtedly immensely popular from at least the 1870s to 1914. The working classes are portrayed as enjoying the depiction of familiar imperial themes and characters. This is a suggestion that they were manipulated in order to encourage their enthusiasm for the empire. In the extract, Mackenzie refers to the case made by Hobson at the time. He argues that historians have rejected Hobson's claims as overdrawn, and claims only that there was genuine enjoyment of the material referred to, not committing himself on whether it was an educator of mob passion, as Hobbes suggested. The music halls were opened in order to make money, and to do that, They needed to appeal to popular taste. This can support Mackenzie's broader point, in contrast to Porter, that the empire was popular among the masses, if only as a form of entertainment. He cites representations of events such as the Indian Mutiny or Rebellion that he looked at in Unit 15, or of the death of General Charles Gordon 1833 to 1885, who was killed defending Khartoum in the Sudan in 1885. Gordon was actually supposed to evacuate the city, but after evacuating civilians, he disobeyed orders and remained to defend it, leading to the death of the men under his command. Those going for a night out simply want to be entertained with stories of differendo, sometimes with a hint of pathos or tragedy. And did the music halls create the taste for empire themes, or similarly meet an existing demand? If the owners and managers of music halls choose to put on entertainment that promoted empire, they must have identified a demand for it. In the final section of this chapter, entitled An Imperial Public, Mackenzie suggests that an imperial ideology, a potent mixture of patriotism, excitement in adventure and colonial warfare, reference for the monarchy, a self-referencing approach to other peoples, admiration for military virtues, represented also by renewed interest in medieval chivalry, and a quasi-religious approach to the obligations of worldwide power come to dominate many aspects of, especially popular culture. Throughout society, sporadic excitements turn patriotism into jignerism, ethnic regard often shaded into outright racism, and imperial self-righteousness was capable of being transformed into extreme velocity. While the masses did at times display support for the use of force to define Britain's perceived interest in places such as South Africa, as you'll see in section 3.3, 20.3, I would suggest that this does not necessarily reflect a quasi-religious approach to the obligations of worldwide prayer. The duty by the United Kingdom to maintain a worldwide Pax Britannica may not have had much appeal to a public more concerned with national pride and national interest. Mackenzie makes a strong case that cultural expressions of empire were highly pervasive, and goes on to argue that the farmers and receivers of metropolitan culture were unlikely to adopt what was inimical to the populace. Empirical culture almost certainly represented a powerful interaction among the classes, illustrating the eagerness of the suppliers of entertainment and popular literature, commercial advertisers, and the founders of youth organisations to attach themselves to it. The public, largely uninterested in specific imperial principles and policies, were none the less fascinated by an empire's existence, its racial connotations, and superior self image, which is offered in respect to the rest of the world. Imperial ideology was a significant aspect of late 19th century nationalism. While it is valid to suggest that commercially minded providers of culture were unlikely to adopt what was inimical to the public, this does not in itself show how enthusiastic the public were for imperialist themes. This could be no more than Porter's minimum of apathy, examples of public excitement over wars, and individual acts of bravery do suggest that the empire held a certain fascination for the public. But we might question whether this demonstrates that imperial ideology was a significant aspect of the 19th century nationalism. The cultural expression of empire pervaded life in Britain as suggested in figures 20.3, 20.4, 20.5, and 20.6. They all were known in the period, and none was unique in a way that it either borrowed for imperial themes or promoted British imperial figures. Even if people were unfamiliar with these particular examples, they are likely to have known others like them. In that sense, then, empire was all around most people in Britain, but we cannot tell from this what effect this had on them. Unit 15 finished by looking at an interconnected British world based on British Isles and colonies of settlement, perhaps linked with an imperial federation. This was arguably a different type of imperialism, one that emphasised a British Empire in which the White Empire would rule over other parts. In this vision, some non-settlement parts of the empire might be dispensable, although, as you see in section 20.2, fears that international rivals would seize strategic colonies meant that British Empire continued to expand during the last decades of the 19th century. James Bellick, 2009. He argues that although the phrase Greater Britain was coined in the 1860s, it was not until 1880s and 1890s that the term came to be widely used, at least among the middle class. In the Times of 18th November 1886, there is reference to emigration as a growth of what is now generally called Greater Britain, suggesting that the phrase, at least, if not the political concept of federation, was common parlance. In the same period, a number of societies were formed to promote links between Britain and its dominions, a development that Bellish suggests was directly connected to international developments such as the unification of Germany and the rise of Russia as an imperial power. Although the British Empire continued to bear prime responsibility for defending the dominions, they were increasingly seen as essential elements in imperial defence. The terms dominions refer to United Kingdom's self-governed settlement colonies Canada, Newfoundland, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. These can be contrasted with colonies such as India and Hong Kong, which, as you saw in Unit 15, were ruled in a much more authoritarian way by imperial governors. The Dominions owned allegiance to the British Crown, but took responsibility for all matters of domestic government and, in time, for matters of foreign policy and defence too. The term was first applied to Canada in 1867, before being extended to other supplement colonies prior to achieving Dominion status. Colonies would be recorded various levels of responsible government, a status that you encountered in Unit 15, meaning that the government was accountable to a local assembly rather than to the British monarch, whereby some decisions were taken by colonial governments rather than by the government in London or its representatives in the colony. Dominion status was sometimes held out as aspirational for India. Although this was not formally announced until 1929, self-government was not initially welcomed by all within the Dominions, partly because it was feared that it would give too much power to vested interest, but also because of fears that it would lead to higher tax rates. The spectre of the American independence mean that the colonial politicians were courted and the premiers of dominions were regularly invited to London, but the fostering links between the United Kingdom and dominions was not one-way process. For the period before 1914, there was considerable enthusiasm in dominions for the Greater British Empire, for instance, Empire Day. An official celebration of British Empire was first launched in Canada in 1899, but did not receive official status in the United Kingdom until 1916. John Darwin has suggested that in the first decade of the 20th century, a sense of Britannic nationalism was influential, though not uncontested, in the Dominions. They developed their own sense of nationhood as Australians, Canadians, and so on, but they perceived that nationality as a form of Britishness. Darwin, 2009. These Britannic nationalists then were the colonial counterparts to imperial federalists in Britain. The British Empire of Dominions can be seen as alliance bound by kingship networks. High levels of emigration to the Dominions in the final decades before the First World War strengthened such networks. Many would have known someone, or at least known of someone, who had settled in British colonies overseas. This too will have contributed to an imperial culture, although again its importance is hard to measure. Anti-imperialism so far. The focus of this section has been on the extent of nature of imperial culture in Britain in the period 1880 to 1914, and how this has been discussed by historians. But what of anti-imperialism? Was there no opposition to empire? Opposition to empire did exist, but its impact was perhaps rather limited. The case against empire has been explored by Gregory Clay's 2010, who argues that it intended to be based either on economic grounds or on moral principles. There were radical philosophers who were opposed to further territorial expansion and sometimes to all forms of imperialism. They included Hobson, who was referred to above in the Mackenzie extract on musicals. Hobson's ideas are known to have influenced Lenin 1870-18 to 1924, the Russian Revolutionary, but like his fellow radical philosophers, he did not reach a mass audience in Britain. Darwin 2009 suggests that the radical critic of empire was fanned into flames by the South African War, but that any such flame burned low by 1910. The anti-imperialists did include some figures of potential influence, a couple of examples being John Morley, whom you encountered in the unit, A Mighty Empire, and A Restless Society. United Kingdom in 1880s, Unit 16, in relation to his role as Irish Secretary in the Liberal Cabinet of 1885 to 86, and C.P. Scott, 1846-1932. Scott was an MP between 1895 and 1905, an editor of the greatest of the Manchester Guardian newspaper for 57 years from 1872 and owner of it from 1905. That a major newspaper gave room to anti-imperialist views was significant, but although Scott himself was firmly opposed to imperial expansion, the approach of the Guardian was to raise question about the issue rather than to campaign against imperialism. Morley was another opponent of imperial expansion, who was more broadly sceptical about empire. As Secretary of State for India in years 1905 and 10, he was responsible for cautious measures known as Morley Minto. Reforms that slightly increased Indian involvement in government, but he was also prepared to maintain British rule by force where he deemed this necessary. And he did not believe that self-government for India was feasible in the short term. Anti-imperialism was, in the main, intellectual and academic and prone to being set aside in the name of practical politics. There appears to have been little ability and perhaps little appetite among such intellectual critics to make anti-imperialism a popular cause. Not was anti-imperialism a major issue for more radical groups in British society. You recall from Unit 7 that Christian groups were prominent in the campaigns against slavery, but the Albigenes Protection Society that was formed by some of these religious campaigners in 1837 campaigned to elevate the negative effects of colonialism, not to end it. Rather than opposing empire, missionaries worked within it to improve the material conditions of indigenous peoples in the empire, as well as to save their souls. Parsons 2004. Similarly, British socialists were concerned at extending democracy at home than in the colonies, and more focused on extending trade union rights and welfare policies in the United Kingdom than in pursuing the end of empire. Although many socialist and Labour representatives were personally opposed to empire, the Independent Labour Party, founded in 1893, and the Labour Party, founded Labour Representation Committee in 1900s, did not make anti-imperialism a central feature of their programmes. However, just as we should be cautious in assuming that enthusiasm for imperial heroes equates to enthusiasm for empire, so we must recognise that the lack of public opposition to imperialism may not tell us much about the views of ordinary people. It can be that imperialistic enthusiasm was simply more eye-catching than anti-imperialism. because the empire could supply a steady stream of heroes that the anti-imperialists could not match. It might be that popular anti-imperialism existed, but was not just quieter. More likely, perhaps, is that popular views had changed since Parliament abolished slavery in 1833. Historian Ronald Hyam refers to a hardening of radical attitudes in the 1860s and the increasing rejection of ideas about the equality of mankind. That can be seen in the anti-slave campaigns of the late 18th to early 19th centuries. Hyam 2002, page 155, 161. Samuel Crowther, 1809, 1891, the first indigenous African to become a bishop of the Anglican Church.